ministry, you know, the wives of senior pastors. And they put on I sponsored a program dealing with child prevention, child abuse prevention and the like. And at that point, Dr. Russell was there and he did a PowerPoint presentation and it just opened up my mind to so many different things concerning this issue that, you know, that I wasn't aware of. And I'm pretty sure that, like I myself was not aware of a lot of these things.
Very good.
I'm sure there's so many other people that are not aware of just the little, I don't know if the word subtle would be the proper word to use, but I'm going to use it. Subtle aspects of child neglect, when people are doing things and not realizing that they're actually neglecting the child in the process. You know, for example, you know, something that's simple to me, I mean, and Dr. Russell can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm sending my child out of the house in the mornings without properly grooming that child, you know, the child goes out, teeth not brushed or face not washed or anything like that. To me, that's a subtle form of neglect, and it may even be a greater form of neglect. But to me, it's neglecting because you're neglecting to provide the care for that child. Or if you got a child, a 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old child, and you haven't trained that child to dress, and you're just saying, go in there and put your clothes on and stuff like that. To me, that's neglecting the child, because my understanding is we're supposed to train up a child in the way that they should go. And that includes, you know, showing them how to sit at the kitchen table and how to hold their knives, their spoons and forks, and how to eat and eat properly, because they're going out and they're going to be interacting in a social setting. And if we don't train them in the house, then we're neglecting the child, because we're neglecting to train the child. So the child gets out into general public and don't know how to connect and function because they've been neglected in the home in terms of being trained in how to do these things. And now, so they go forth and they don't have the necessary social skill to interact.
And Dr. Russell, I would imagine you would also say that the very word neglect is exactly what you mean, which is to say not to pay any attention to, not to help, or not to inform, not to teach, and et cetera. And so anytime that a parent is not teaching his child, he or she is neglecting that child. Not only a parent, any other individuals who don't deal. Would that be a correct statement in reference to how sociologists and others look at this?
Neglect is anything that prevents a person from developing the skills necessary for life, you know, to deal with life. It's, you know, it can be as subtle as, you know, not telling a child or teaching a child the ABCs. It could be, you know, as subtle as not, as Dr. Walker said, it's teaching them how to brush their teeth in the morning, teaching them how to groom their hair, how to prepare to go out and meet society. You know, we often, you know, because we only see abuse and neglect when it's at a very large scale, when, you know, you have the parent who drowns her children, or you have the parent who puts the child in a microwave, and those types of, and we see that as abuse and neglect. But there's so many other forms of abuse and neglect that go unnoticed, you know, to the untrained eye for a kid that comes to school, for example.
As a matter of fact, I think that was the best example that you could think of, Dr. Russell, when we talk about neglect, because every teacher who watches children come into his or her classroom can determine which child is neglected simply by looking at that child. You can tell whether a child is well groomed, the way the child speaks, everything in reference to the child. You can and so in a real sense, it's just the human experiences that are not passed on by the caregiver to the child. And anytime those human experiences are not passed on, then that child is what? Considered to be neglect.
I watched, I had a training on traumatic brain injury, and it was surprising that some forms of neglect and abuse has such an effect on normal brain activity and functioning. You know, a child not, you know, withholding food from a child, how it can actually affect that child later on in life.
Oh, yes.
You know, withholding love, you know, and just really nurturing, withholding that nurturing mother or father type of connection with that child can actually affect certain brain activity to where the child grows up with these holes, where they, then they start looking for other things to fill those holes.
Well, when you deal with, doctor, your clients, how do you bring them in to deal with them? I mean, do they come to you and say that I've neglected my child, or are they sent to you by somebody? I mean, how do you get in touch with these?
Normally, I know up front that they've been, they're coming to me as dependent neglect, because that's the way that the referrals come into me, and it states that they're dependent neglect, and it kind of gives me, an overall view of what type of neglect the child has been subjected to. And so when I'm working with that child, the first thing I try to do is to gain their trust. Because one of the things that children need to know, especially kids coming from abusive environments, is that they can trust the people that have some control over their lives. Because when you look at a child who's been abused by his mother or his parents, that child has zero trust with any other adult. Because if the person who brought me in the world is not going to take care of me, the stranger certainly ain't going to do it. So then you've got to take time to build the trust. Trust is essential. Dr. Nicholas Hobbs talked about trust being essential in the relationship between a child and a parent, or a child and an adult. And then once you can gain that trust, you find out what their deficits are, whether they need to help it. And then you start working with that child on how to overcome those deficits in their life. And the main thing, as in the presentation I did with Dr. Walker, that you have to do with a child, you got to say it, mean it, and do it. You can't say something and then you don't do it. You got to say it, you got to mean it, you got to do it. Because kids look at follow through. That's how you build trust, whether that's a consequence or reward.
And so you have an opportunity to deal with children within that range under the program that you work with.
Yes, sir.
And that's part of your occupation in a real sense. And of course, we're going to take this commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. The topic is aspects of child abuse and neglect, and we're talking to Dr. Russell and Pastor Walker. And so, Pastor Walker, let's see if we can start this third segment by dealing with some aspects from your own personal position in reference to your own personal views, as well as to allow Dr. Russell to bring in sort of an institutionalized point of view in terms of the institutions that he worked with and how they handle these issues of child abuse. Any aspect of that? Okay, let's talk about it.
You know, Dr. Hammond, Dr. Russell, he mentioned about, you know, nourishing the child. And, you know, the Bible talks about fathers, you know, provoke not your child to wrath, but bring him up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And as a young man, my first child was born when I was age 17. My oldest son, I was age 17 when he was born. Of course, I knew nothing about, you know, child rearing and anything like that. And surely, some of my actions and behavior over the period of years of my life amounted to neglect, because you know, in a lot of aspects, even just the fact that I went to prison was a form of neglect of my children and everything. But I didn't know. I was taught that, you know, the woman, she took care, she brought up the children, she took care of the children, made sure they had their needs. I never knew that the father had a more involved role in that process than what I thought. You know, I'm thinking is, you know, you go out, you make some money, you know, you provide, you pay for stuff, you know, you buy stuff, and of course, unfortunately, we got a court system that's relegating fathers to that situation, to that position as well, because they're saying you pay child support and spend, you know, every other weekend with your child, you know, and that's really not, you know, sufficient really to raise a child. But that's what I grew up with, thinking, you know, that it was a woman's role to do that, and it wasn't my role.
Man is the breadwinner.
Yeah, the breadwinner.
Yeah. So I think in a real sense, Dr. Russell, you would also say that many of us probably grew up in that confine, in that concept, with those concepts, especially if you didn't grow up with a silver spoon in your mouth, and et cetera. If you came from the other side, and which does not mean that you can't be neglected in a palace, but in a real sense, I think that we're more susceptible, in a real sense, poor folks are more susceptible to that than any other group. Is that, would you say that?
I would agree. We parent how we were parented. That's how it's passed on. It's through our point of reference is our own experience as a child, and we parent that same way until we know better. Growing up in a single parent home myself, you know, if I didn't have, I have two sisters in my immediate family, and if their husbands, you know, they took time to actually mentor for me what it was to be a man, and I watched them in their interaction with my sisters, and also my oldest sister, she's dead and gone. Her husband just died last year. They raised me from, you know, for about 12 years of my life. So I had that dual family role, and my sister was at home, was a stay-at-home mom, so to speak, and my brother-in-law went to work every day. He slayed the bear and brought him home for my sister to dress him. And so I learned from him what it was to be a man, but he also had a sense of connection with me, that he spent that time with me, not just paying the bills and putting food on the table and clothes on my back.
He served as a mentor to you in a real sense.
He mentored me, exactly, in a real sense. And a lot of times the kids that come to us, they come to us without that. And so what we try to do tests to determine where they are. We can do, you know, psychological testing, we can do psychoeducational testing, psychosexual testing to determine how deeply wounded they are in terms of their abuse, and so we'll know where to start at with working with this child. But one of the main things they need is for one person to take an interest in them and invest in their lives, because that one person can actually help them turn their corner. Because see, an abused child, in all probability, would become an abuser if you don't treat the abuse. A child who's been exposed to sexual abuse, their point of reference is it's okay to touch, you know, to touch your child. So if you don't treat that, it's only going to be precipitated in their life, you know, as they grow up into adulthood and as they have children. They will get into unhealthy, you know, relationships. They'll get into promiscuous activity. You know, it's a whole lot of things that can happen if you leave it untreated. But if you get them quick enough, early enough, know what's going on, see what the deficits are, and then build a program around those deficits, you can help stem the tide of abuse.
And one of the most important components, I would imagine, Pastor, is LOVE. Which is to say that as long as a child understands that he or she is LOVE, respect, understanding, goodwill, and et cetera, then that can overcome all kinds of child abuse and neglect and et cetera. But that child has to understand that. Is that what we're saying here?
Unconditionally. You know, a lot of times abused children think they've got to do something to earn that love because they come from that environment. But you got to show them that you love them unconditionally. It doesn't come with a price tag. You don't have to be a rocket scientist in school for me to love you or to brag about, you know, brag about what you do. I'm going to love you regardless, you know. And so that child learns to be accepted for who they are, and they stop trying to fit into some other role to satisfy. Because a lot of times an abused child will try to fit a role because they think if I fit that role, I can avoid the abuse.
Wow. And of course, what I think we've got about, 3 more minutes before the end of this show today. And what would you like to leave in a real sense, Dr. Russell, with our audience this morning on how they might be able to better communicate and better work with their children? But not only with their children, but how they might also work with other children as well.
I think one of the things I'd like to leave with everybody is we are prone by nature to react to negative situations. The child acts out, then we react to that negative acting out. What I would like to recommend is that as adults, that we try to catch children doing good. You know, be observant enough to see them when they're doing something right and compliment them for what they've done right. You would be surprised how much that does to their self-esteem. Especially if they're coming from environments where they're told they're wrong, everything they do is wrong, you know. And it doesn't have to be the parent that catches that child doing good. It could be a teacher, it could be, you know, a social worker, it could be just the pastor of the church, it could be a deacon in the church, you know, because that whole village mentality, it really needs to be implemented in our communities. We need to, as a community, pull together to stem the tide of abuse among our children.
And trying to do whatever we can in order to increase their self-esteem, how they feel about themselves.
How they feel about
because how they feel about themselves is how they will act toward others, you see. And a bully will generally try to bully other folks, you see, because he understands that he himself is a bully and etc. And so, Pastor, we've got about 1 minute and 21 seconds during this last segment here. Let's see if have you got any final statements. Then perhaps we'll allow Dr. Russell to sort of close us out this morning.
Yeah, I'm just thankful that Dr. Russell is coming on here today and saying some of the things that he's saying, because he makes some valid points, especially when he talks about, you know, speaking to or actually looking for opportunities to catch the child doing something right and good, and then compliment him, because I know you can only raise somebody's self-esteem by doing something like that, and further enhance who they are and who you grooming them to be. And I just thank God for knowing Pastor Russell. Like I said, I don't have a degree, but I know some sharp, smart people.
And we appreciate you bringing us this smart man by this morning to give us some information in reference to various aspects of child abuse and neglect. I don't think that any of us have said anything that people are not familiar with, but I think that we had an opportunity to sort of bring it all together for them this morning. And I want to thank the two of you for doing that. And I want to encourage our audience to tune in again next week to another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning.